Hey everybody, welcome to You're Not the Audience. This is a live show where I break down brands, products, and subcultures that stand out by not appealing to everyone. I'm Calvin, creative director at Parliament, and Parliament is a brand transformation agency in good old Portland, Oregon, and we help brands when they're facing big changes, and we do that with strategy, identity, positioning, all that good stuff. And today we're going to talk about branding of the 90s and how those brands kind of stopped giving a shit and became cynical and ironic and eventually maybe led themselves to a new, more sincere version of themselves after that. So it's gonna be fun. I like all those 90s brands that we think about, like you had like extreme sports, really extreme graphics, everything got aggressive, really cynical. I think it's going to be a fun chat. So I'm a sucker for all that era of brand design. So normal structure of the episode today, we'll go over just some recent news with Parliament. Not a ton going on, very chill right now. We're just working away on projects, but so we'll have a little bit of news. We will then kind of jump into talking about the 90s for a little while, 45 minutes, an hour, talk about some things that we can learn from that era of design, how we can maybe apply some that thinking to the future or how we shouldn't. And yeah, so how's everyone doing today? Everyone ready to get their 90s nostalgia mood in today? I think it's gonna be funny. I hope somebody joins the stream who just I hope there's a young designer that joins there where this is just like absolutely crazy to them to think about talking about 90s branding. So, but unfortunately, some of us were alive in the 90s. We've had some junior designers at Parliament where when they tell you that they were born in like 2000, I'm just like, how is this possible? How is anyone that young? As far as news for Parliament, not a ton. We're just like heads down, working on a bunch of projects, working on some fall and winter stuff for good old Capital One, one of our fave clients. And then we also kicked off a new project with Prometheus Apartments, which is their client we've worked with for a long time. They make luxury. They're essentially a luxury apartment property developer in like the Bay, Portland, Seattle. Really thoughtful, really smart, really artfully minded people working there. It's so good. I love working with them always. We've done a lot of buildings with them, and they really, really like see branding and design as an integral part of creating spaces, interiors, exteriors, thinking how people react and interact with spaces. I think they're a super unique company. So excited to kick off work with them. Otherwise, we're just kind of in, I guess in Portland, we're in the waning time of summer, so we're all sneaking in all of our like last trips. I just planned a trip to Nashville, so I'm going to be gone for a week in a couple weeks. We're all trying to hit the river, get in that last glimpse of sun before the gray and rain comes. So, all right, I think let's start talking about the 90s. I think this is, so I think the real question is why is it even worth thinking about the 90s right now? And I think one big reason is just there's been this huge surge of interest and like the classic nostalgia cycle where the 90s and early 2000s are fully back now. Oh, just 1 second. I'm getting an error in my YouTube showing that I have been signed out. Let me make sure I'm still streaming here. Hold on 1 sec. I think this is maybe still working. If anyone's in chat, let me know if you're seeing this here. Okay, are we still going? I think we're still going. All right. All right, I think we're back. for some reason, I just got logged out of my YouTube completely. No idea what happened there, so I couldn't see chat or anything. All right, let's jump into it. So, why do I think the 90s are worth thinking about? We're in that like nostalgic cycle loop of the 90s and 2000s are fully back. And the one problem is, I think when these cycles start happening, we really start viewing them through rose-tinted glasses, where it removes a lot of like the cultural reason that those movements and moments were created. So I think it's really important for us to remember, especially as designers, branders, and brand strategists, that it's important for us to remember the countercultural movement that made all these eras happen. Because, you know, they didn't happen in a vacuum. And the other reason I want to talk about this is, like, I love a rebel outlaw brand, and I love creating brands that actively stand against something. And this is an era where almost every brand was trying to do that. It became like the main mode of communicating in the 90s and early 2000s. So I think this then, what happened in the 90s? So why did all these brands start getting weird? Why did so many brands get cynical, ironic, super aggressive, ugly? They got really self-aware and meta. You had brands like Diesel Jeans. I'll run us through some examples of a bunch of this stuff here in a minute, but we've got Diesel Jeans, which was like luxury alternative brand. We had OK Soda, which was like Coke's answer to the kind of alternative countercultural movement. We had No Fear, that clothing brand where it was all about aggression and really like selling an attitude beyond just products. You had Jones Soda, which like really like completely changed how we look at soda and packaging design. And one of my faves is we had Marzocchi, a client of ours, who was doing crazy stuff in the mountain biking world. And I think part of the reason I like all of these areas was like it went beyond just aesthetic. It really reflected a generation that became suspicious of corporations, of consumerism, and the idea of like a mass monoculture that really was created especially in the 80s and like the decades up to that. But so in order, I think, in order to kind of understand, I think in order to understand the 90s, we have to kind of know where the 80s were at. We got to understand the 80s, and I think a lot of that cynicism was really born with what the 80s were trying to promise us. You know, we had that like Reagan era optimism where I think let's all hope that we're at a point where we can start agreeing. Well, anymore, normally it'd be everyone's like, fuck Reagan, worst president ever. But I don't know, maybe we're being outdone by that right now. We had a huge massive growth in corporate power, in consumerism and Wall Street influence in the 80s. We had just blatant consumerism, and brands were really sincere about just selling a kind of like wholesome aspiration and a better life. The idea that if you buy this, you will become successful. So and we became really skeptical of that. So we became skeptical, and the whole world started beginning to react to this culturally. And you see this in some like really fun, simple examples of like, in music, you had the polish of like hair metal and glam rock, but that then led to kind of the outsider drugs and dirtbaggery of the grunge movement. You had polished pop and new wave music, and that kind of led to then gangster rap, and that took over pop music. But my specific area of interest is throughout all of that, and throughout all of culture and art, the 80s kind of symbolized this end of like high modernism in art and culture and led to postmodernism. And when I'm like talking about that, for anyone who's nerdy enough about this stuff, think like Donald Judd, minimalist, pure cube sculptures, to like the messy, like identity-filled paintings of Basquiat. Like that's the kind of like cultural movement we're talking about. And so when we're thinking about what that dramatic change from modernism to postmodernism did, let's just kind of talk about that a little bit, because I think these things feel really amorphous, and they're really just movements that describe the invisible forces that are guiding our culture as a whole. And it feels like something you should only learn about in art school, but these are larger cultural movements. And what that, kind of like what those all symbolize, like modernism, mid-century, kind of peaked in 70s and 80s, really, was this idea that like modernism believed in the power of progress, the idea of universality, that all are one, kind of everything can be universal. It believed in like rational and logical systems. And just the idea of like one pure truth, the idea that there was only like one good like solution, one good answer. And postmodernism was a reaction that really called bullshit to this. As the world became more globalized, we learned about other cultures, we realized there is no one truth. We realized everything is relative, and pluralism and relativism became the norm because we gained more knowledge about the world. And as globalization really started taking hold. And for branding and art, what is really important that we realize is that meaning really depends on context. It's about what the culture brings to it, what the viewer brings to it. It can't just be a thing existing in a silo by itself. And that's what like a lot of like minimalist artists from the modernist era, where you have a cube, it's in a room, it exists only as it exists. A lot of ideas like that. And so we had this realization that we're not one global monoculture, and individual identity could be highlighted instead of like generalized, and identity could even be constructed. And this was a time then when like there was a flattening of high and low culture. You had luxury meeting with like low culture things, and the idea that those things could exist together, and that led to basically what we now think of as like the start of like remixing. Like it led to the aesthetic, ideological culture of remixing disparate art forms, ideas, perspectives, products. And that was like, that's the creation of like postmodernism. This idea where all of these things could mix together, and based on context, we had different perspectives on them. So that's like a big heady like reason as to like why there was this transition to the 90s, where all of a sudden everything became more complex, more nuanced, more cynical, more edgy. Because like we realized that we had been kind of sold this universal story that didn't apply to all of us anymore. So there's this realization that the world was more complex and nuanced than we ever thought, because now the world's more connected than ever. Globalization is happening. We get bigger context for the rest of the world. And so we started realizing that corporations were kind of selling a lie, that there was this like one truth that led to happiness. And it really generated this idea that was like, this was so rife during the 90s. The idea of selling out. Like, I feel like that was like, if you were like an alternative kid in the 90s, early 2000s, the idea of selling out was like your greatest fear. There was this fear of buying into what the corporations were selling. And we were all suspicious of selling out. And that became kind of a major anxiety of that time, of like giving in to the corporations. So that was a really unique time. And I think Gen X became really distrustful of brands because they saw the world around them and they realized that corporations were no longer reflecting the authentic view of their world. So that was what really created the distrust in that moment. Big changes in the world, corporations hadn't caught up. Tale as old as time. Second, I gotta adjust my mic here a little bit. Getting a little hot today. I must be excited. I'm talking a lot. So that then just begs the question, at a time when consumers were becoming really distrustful of brands, corporations, like what does a corporation do to start targeting people who don't trust them and are skeptical of selling out and conforming to them? What do all those corporations do? They create alternative, cynical, edgy brands. Tons of corporations at this time, like big corporations, Coca-Cola, all those, Miller Beer, created all these like sub-brands that were like meant to capture that countercultural movement. And this really led to the rise of anti-hero brands. I love anti-hero brands. We loved anti-heroes in the 90s. Think of like MTV relied on this wholly. Even Nickelodeon had this. When you think of big cultural like entertainment, we think of we had Bart Simpson, we had Beavis and Butthead, we had Ren and Stimpy, we had like Fox in those days was like, that was like their whole brand of like entertainment on TV. And it was this realization that idealism was gone and our heroes could be like flawed, cynical, obnoxious, disaffected people. And I think that allowed brands to exude part of ourselves that I think we were all afraid to express. Like that gave us as like consumers and as fans of products and brands, that gave us permission to be a little bit messy, to be a little bit more complicated, to be a little bit annoying, to be a little bit aggressive, to be a little bit, all the things that we were kind of told weren't this like perfect, sophisticated, beautiful, like high-end version of what we were sold in the 80s, like this high-end version of consumerism. So if anybody has like favorite brands from the 90s that they think align with this, toss them in the chat. I love, and there's like, I feel like there's always new ones to discover or always ones I've forgotten about. But okay, so the idea that these like captured things we were afraid to express, it was often led by like large corporations creating these sub-brands to capture the countercultural movement. Some did it well, some not so well. Some met with some success, and some just kind of wore out their welcome. But I'm gonna run this through some. They're really fun. They're great ones. Like I'm gonna start with my personal favorite from this era. Let me hop over here. So Coca-Cola started realizing that they weren't quite aligning with the zeitgeist. So they go and they create this soda called OK Soda. Not a huge success, notoriously didn't taste great, but incredible branding, very much of the era, very self-aware. And when you think about like, they did the opposite of what Coke does. Like Coke sells happiness, refreshment, togetherness, optimism, all of those things. So they created OK Soda, where it's really self-aware. It's not amazing, it's just okay. It's about just being okay in a complicated world. And it developed this like really anti-advertising attitude, and it became really manifesto-like. You've got like fun lines on here, like on the top of like the lip of the can, you know, it says things like, you drank OK brand soda, something okay happened to you, grab the phone and call us. Like you could call them on the phone. Like there's no real secret to feeling okay. Tons of great writing. Awesome art by Daniel Close. The cans look so great. I love it. But the problem is it didn't taste great. And so, great looking stuff. They had all these, even their ads from this time were like very much like not polished, black and white, gritty. Even like they're really calling it out here deliberately, like do not seek cynicism, it will come to you naturally. That's one of their ads. They got it. It's great. They had manifestos. Manifestos are a big thing for rebel and outlaw brands, so you'd see a lot of this then. This is the portfolio here that we're looking at of Charlotte Moore, who is the art director and creative director on this. I think this was done by Wieden and Kennedy in Portland in the 90s. Legendary work. But okay, that's OK Soda. I love it. Then we had other big brands like Miller. Oh no, that's Jones Soda. I'll jump back to Jones in a second because we're going to talk about that later. We then had Miller create Red Dog beer. So at this time, American lagers became this like wholesome symbols of craft and American values and like American individualism, all that kind of like good, wholesome stuff. So then they created Red Dog, which was kind of for like, Red Dog's attitude was it was for like a guy who was ready to get into a fist fight in the bar. You know, it was like, it wasn't happy. It had this grumpy like bulldog on the cover. Even their, let's see if I can pull this up here. Even their tagline was uncommonly smooth. it is like inherently setting up a stance against something. Premium beer from the Plank Road Brewery, that's like a classic trick that large-scale domestic brewers like use. It's not from Miller, it's from their Plank Road Brewery. But Red Dog was actually pretty successful. But I love the look of it. It's great. Just very much of that era. You had, I think one of the ones that I feel like everyone remembers and kind of has forgotten, though, is No Fear. No Fear clothing came out then. All the other clothing brands in this era were doing like focusing on performance or fashion, some kind of like sophistication. You had the like, maybe the like Tommy Hilfigers of the world, like that kind of stuff. No Fear came at it from like, this is aggressive clothing for extreme people doing extreme sports. And you know, like boxers, skateboarders, motocross racers, all those people started repping these brands. And it was like all about just selling attitude. They were just t-shirts. They sold attitude though. And this is like such a great example. Maybe this will become more relevant later in this conversation, but they're still around. No Fear still exists. They relaunched earlier this year. And you see that they like, this is their new look. Like No Fear Sport. They're trying to do this. And it's like, such an example. I mean, this is literally the headline here. No Fear's new logo print proves brands are terrified to stand out. Absolutely my thought when I saw this. Like, where'd the character go? Where'd the attitude go? That was the only thing they had. They removed the whole spirit of the brand with this update. Unbelievable. Terrible decision. But okay, let's keep talking some other fun ones. Another one that was like absolutely legendary was Diesel. So Diesel jeans, we all know Diesel. They were known for, you know, they were a luxury brand, but like from the 80s, it was all just like posh, elegant, sophisticated, trying to do this kind of like clean upper crust kind of feel. Diesel came in and just adopted the visual language of all of those brands, turned it on its head, and attacked like traditional advertising aesthetics. And it created this really awesome like meta narrative within all of their work. It made them super successful. Like this ad here, which is like definitely one you would never see now. But it really set up this clear like us versus them. Here's the like fat cats who don't get it. And we're the cool kids who are just kind of like judging them quietly. And so not very, you know, maybe not great for today's market, but they just had this, they had this whole attitude that was like, really, I mean, they really went for it. And I think like everything became a really dark joke to them. All the typical luxury fans, they just set them up as like, they were like pompous blowhards. And I think the most interesting part about them, it often wasn't about like, it wasn't about them showing this like elegant, beautiful world. It wasn't this, they weren't trying to sell you this idea that you were going to look beautiful at the party. They were trying to sell you the like morning after when you've got a hangover, but you are kind of reveling in the moment you had. Like that's what they were focusing on. Super good, real fun. I don't know where Diesel is these days. We'll talk about the limited time effect of some of these choices. But they were really good at just like showing how the real world really worked. And they made luxury clothes for those who get it and nothing for those who don't. The other one, apparently my YouTube and stream is just having troubles today. We'll just keep going. Might be getting a little stuttery. Sorry on your end if you're seeing some stuttering and slowdown. Okay, a couple more, just for fun. We all remember Jones Soda. This was another great like stance against old 80s corporate consumerism, consistency, all of that stuff. You know, all soda brands were super consistent. They were kind of inhuman. They were polished. And Jones came in with this whole idea that like you become the label. You submit photos to them. You get a chance of it showing up on one of their labels. It became this constantly rotating label of like art and photography, and it was just no one was doing anything like that. It blew up. They kind of screwed themselves when they tried going too big and kind of started killing off some of their like spirit. They switched over to plastic bottles. A lot of stuff happened where they kind of threw away some of their equity, but they still exist. But such an awesome decision during then, just like you become the label. It's great. And one that's one that's particularly close to Parliament's heart is Marzocchi. So Marzocchi Marzocchi makes forks for mountain bikes. They've been around since the 90s, and actually maybe 80s. Can't remember exact year. I should know this. So Marzocchi was a client of ours. We actually updated their brand a few years ago. They got picked up by a new owner, but back in the 90s, they had some cool aesthetics, but this was still the early era of like extreme sports, and Marzocchi kind of wanted to come into it making a mark. A lot of other brands were still focusing on like extreme performance and tinkering and making you like super badass. Or like Marzocchi leaned into it, like they celebrated sex, like epic moments, the excitement of feel over just technical bullshit. And I think like some of it they went a little too insane on. Like this is Pink Bike's breakdown of their brand. And so I mean, it just had this whole aesthetic, which is great. But then really where they like, I would say hit their stride, and also maybe their thing where it started being like, what are you guys doing? Was they started this era of like late 90s, early 2000s. They started just doing this where it was like full on basically like porn star sex sells like stuff, which was like certainly unique, stood out in that time amongst the mountain biking people. But when you look back on it now, you're kind of like, what does any of that do? But I mean, some of this aesthetic's great though. Very fun. So they came to us some years ago, and it was like, how do we update their brand while keeping some of that idea? Like we focused on this whole idea of stoke with them. This is our case study from them, which was great. It's like all just about get rowdy on the regular. It was all just about like the feeling of riding. We updated their mark. I love where this one turned out. It was great. Gave them some directions for packaging. So we pushed them to just be like, it really is about feel, epic moments. We removed like kind of the cheesy porn star aesthetic and just cleaned it up and made it this like alternative, aggressive, like all the idea of bombers, the idea of bombing, going down big hills, doing big jumps. It was a real fun change. So Aaron, Marzi, there's a I guess this is a fine time to talk about it. There's we shot a whole series of commercials for Marzocchi that were absolutely absurd years ago, and I don't know if they ended up using any of them because they got real wacky, and I think they were a little nervous about going that far. So sometimes we do push people too far, but it featured a character called Marzi in it. Which Marzi was actually, or no, I forget what the actual character's name. The character was a mascot that was a stick of butter to try to communicate that all of your epic rides were going to be completely buttery smooth. that was a real stretch on that one. Okay. Any other like favorite kind of 90s brands I'm not thinking of? I mean, also on my list I have like Big Dog, if anybody remembers Big Dog t-shirts, that kind of stuff. There's like so many different brands. And like one thing I do want to call out that I think was also really important, like super influential in design and culture during this time. There was a magazine called Adbusters. So Adbusters, which is great, you can get their whole, or like most of their archive on archive.org. They also have a ton of it on their website. So Adbusters was this anti-capitalist, anti-consumer, non-profit magazine that kind of used the aesthetics of corporations to communicate their ideological stance, and was actually super influential in the 90s. And in the 2000s even, it was actually what led to creating the Occupy Wall Street movement. It started in the pages of Adbusters. And so Adbusters like, you can check their archives. It's great. You can see a whole on archive.org. You can see most of their issues on here. I mean, you can see from this cover, they were certainly trying to be provocative. And their magazine was great. It was really about communicating like all the things about the globalist capitalist world that we weren't paying attention to. This specific issue was called "Is the American Dream Negotiable?" And it specifically talked about, like, in a globalized economy, what we are sacrificing by getting all the things we want, like what damage we are causing across the planet. And this was in the 90s. I mean, stuff still relevant. Never became irrelevant, that's for sure. So cool, very cool magazine. Tons of really cool stuff. They had like this design anarchy on, lots of really, like, this was an era when just magazines were wild. I loved it. These are actually all, these are the ones from the 2000s. They started late 90s, if I remember right. But Adbusters is great. So that's maybe a whole other talk some day. We'll talk about Adbusters. Okay. So that's a bunch of the brands, kind of what they did. It was always really about looking at culture at large and creating a really harsh distinction against that larger monoculture that was being sold to us. But then at some point, a problem starts happening. There's this huge countercultural movement, and then mainstream brands like Coke and those, they start adopting this. And you had mainstream brands like really double down on it. You had Taco Bell with their absurd Chihuahua ads. You had Doritos. Doritos became all about like extreme aggressive flavor and attitude. You had that, like, all of those brands start adopting it. And then that's kind of when mainstream corporations kind of ruined it all. They stopped caring. They were just like, you know what? We're going to go hard. We've got to like mimic what the counterculture is doing. And we all know how this pattern goes. Big countercultural movement happens. Counterculture rejects the mainstream, creates their own aesthetics. Those aesthetics become desirable. Brands and big corporations steal those aesthetics. Those aesthetics then become mainstream. Then a whole new countercultural movement develops and rejects that new aesthetic. And that is the cycle we live in forever. But that was like especially true during this time. Like this like movement in the 90s of like brands pushing towards this aggressive kind of cynical take was so widespread that it essentially then, that's what led into this, what's often referred to as like the new sincerity moment of like the hipster movement and all millennial branding, how everything got like so soft and feely and sincere and really caring about everything. That was a direct response to all these mainstream brands pulling together their own like countercultural brands. So it kind of like undercut everything that whole countercultural movement stand for. Creates the new sincerity movement of the 2000s. Maybe we'll talk about that next week. Hipster brands and millennial branding. So, but then what happened then is like that 90s anti-branding became the standard for branding, which is just a funny idea to think, but this is how these cycles go. Cynicism and irony became the standard. That became like the standard ways of communicating for brands. Meta narratives became super common. And that just ruled. I mean, at the point where Doritos are doing it, come on. The problem with that, though, is that sarcasm, aggression, all of those kinds of emotions and communication tools just become really exhausting. And we're basically experiencing some of that now in our like current world, where like all media and everything is designed to enrage us. It's like these are emotions that become very exhausting. They create very taxing emotional states, and we eventually get tired of them. So that was then why during the 2000s there was this turn to brands really hitting on like genuine conviction, really caring about others. And at that moment, that became the new distinction, and that's what led to that new sincerity movement. So that's why we can't have nice things. At some point, mainstream brands get all of, like, gather up all their money, spin off sub brands, ruin the whole movement. Dang it. Okay. Yeah, any other brands I'm not thinking of from that era that we can learn something from? That anyone in chat can think of? There's got to be some other brands I'm not thinking of that were like really... I mean, we had the whole era of like X Games, but that was like... What year... Does anyone know what year X Games started? That had to have been somewhere around there. I don't know, we had... That was like, I think, a really major influence in that time. Skateboarding culture. I didn't talk about Thrasher magazine. Thrasher became such a big influence during this time. It definitely became like a cultural moment. Oh, Aaron, 95 X Games. Yeah, dang. For some reason, it's wild to me to think that that means like the X Games are, what, 31 years old? It's crazy. We're all old. Okay. So I mean, I think that kind of like then, I don't know, what lessons can we learn from this then? What lessons can designers, brand strategists learn from all this like uprising of countercultural branding and then the fall of it? I think one thing is just that like it becomes a viable option to react against the dominant culture. Reacting against the dominant culture can create like a really important, powerful moment of distinction, but there can be a time limit on that, because when you're setting yourself up against a dominant cultural moment, that means that moment's probably going to end at some point. One thing to think about is how a brand like Harley, like best, maybe most consistent rebel outlaw brand to ever exist, they're always against something. Their like type of culture they stood up against is something that like basically crosses all time. They're against like the 9 to 5. They're against like the status quo. That's why they've been able to be so consistent in reacting against like a dominant culture. So you have to like really focus on, if you're reacting against a dominant culture, is it like a trend focused thing? I think that's something to be really mindful of. The other thing I think we can learn from this is like, always remember that your audience understands advertising and branding. They'll get the joke. They're smart. You can be blatant about selling something. That's fine. They get it. They know what advertising is, especially anymore. So... Oh, Ryan, fueling the tank. What's good? Got stuck in meetings today. Oh, that's the worst. Don't you know it's lunchtime on Thursday? No meetings on lunchtime on Thursday. Ryan, I feel like you have some thoughts on good 90s edgy brands. If there's any that come to mind, drop them in the chat. So other things I think we can learn from this time of like the 90s is that like, I think this remains true forever. The idea that contradictions have and always will be, or always will create interesting identities. A lot of these really, like when you're talking about opposing dominant culture, what you're really doing is setting up a contradiction between yourself and them. And putting it on display, I think, has been really, really, like, that'll just never go out of fashion. Trying. Well, I work on The Sims, and that revival has been great from a nostalgia standpoint. Oh man, The Sims, yeah, that's interesting. Like, I haven't really talked about any games in this yet today. There's definitely, I mean, there's so many games of that era. I mean, we talked about like X Games. Games-wise, when you think about like Tony Hawk, like what Tony Hawk meant to people, Tony Hawk was like a lot of people's first introduction to punk. Like, that's wild to think, but that was like a lot of people's first introduction to anti-capitalist punk, like anti-consumerist mindset. And it was all through Tony Hawk. And then people like went back and discovered like Thrasher magazine and all of those things. And I mean, we talked about in previous episodes, we talked about Wipeout. Wipeout was absolutely a part of this 90s movement of like contradicting UK rave culture with like Japanese like futurist aesthetics. And it was all to comment on like overconsumption, all this sub-branding that happens, or subvertising, where you're like creating fake brands to like put eyes on the ideas of like capitalism, consumerism, and the problems of all those. Wipeout was absolutely a part of that. So go back, for anyone who hasn't seen it, go back and watch the Wipeout episode. It was great. But okay, what other was it? Yeah, a lot. And says a lot of it bled into the 2000s, but game advertising as a whole did not give a fuck back then. Oh yeah, like all advertising in general was just kind of like take a stance, go absurd, maybe too extreme. And oh yeah, said Fuel Tank. Some of it hasn't aged well, but the way companies were trying to actually be edgy was certainly a time. Yeah, I like. You would have missed it earlier, but I threw up like the Diesel Jeans ads where they're like very obviously like making fat jokes of people who are like rich and everything like that. That's kind of like things where you're like, the edgelordiness of that time was certainly its own unique specific moment. That's for sure. Things that certainly anymore you're like, okay, that's just like punching down, but okay. So, I mean, some other things I think that we learned from the 90s, like brands and early 2000s brands, were that attitude itself can kind of become a differentiator. And when the product is done right, you know, we had No Fear, the explosion of that brand, that was all attitude. It was just a clothing brand that slapped slogans and manifestos on things. But maybe the most important thing to learn that was eventually the downfall of this is that like counterculture just can't be copied. Like you have to actually be rebellious and truly believe in what you're standing for. I think that's some of the downside of like, I mean, or that was a lot of the downfall of a lot of these brands, was they were created by larger corporations that at some point they can't keep that angst going. They can't keep that rebellion going because it's just, people start realizing that it's a giant corporation that's owning it, or it's just hard to kind of keep that momentum going in general as culture changes quickly now. But all right. Oh, Nick, not 90s, but Pepsi and Kendall Jenner was a major faceplant. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, oh god, Pepsi. Pepsi has just never been able to define who they are. Like, Pepsi has always just had the challenge of, like, their biggest rebellion Pepsi has ever been able to do. They've tried so many times to be, like, the anti-Coke. Like, but where they like blatantly communicate that like we're not like Coke basically, but all that ever does is that just communicates, that just sells the brand that you're trying to fight against. And Pepsi's done that forever. Aaron, the Canada of Coke. Yeah, that's what Pepsi is. It's just, yeah, Pepsi just can't, like, I don't, please someone tell me what Pepsi stands for. It seems like the fact that it is like number 2, it's probably not even number 2 anymore. It's probably like Mountain Dew is number 2 or something like that anymore. But the fact that for so long Pepsi was number 2 in like the soda market is just insane. Like they have just been the most soulless company that's like never been consistent. I do not get it. They had a great mark, their old classic Pepsi logo, fantastic. And then they even screwed that up for a while with their like weird like winking ribbon, which looked just like Coke's ribbon. So, I don't know. So many bad decisions happening there. Okay. Just some, then, so that's some stuff we can learn. Reacting against dominant culture can create some distinction. Your audience understands advertising. Contradictions will always be powerful. Attitude can become a differentiator, and counterculture can't be copied. That's like, that's some big things we can think about. Well, I guess kind of like final thoughts time on 90s and when brands stopped giving a shit. So the 90s, the transition from the 80s to 90s, the 90s as a whole became this like pluralist, culture-wide rebellion against corporatism and monoculture. And the funny thing is, like, that even becomes ironic in itself, is because then that became the dominant monoculture to some extent. But I think the part for me that's most interesting about the time is that the solution for brands wasn't just to create new identities and new products. They all fully adopted their audience's skepticism of the time. And I think that was like a big moment where like brands have always been in conversation with like whatever like is going on in the world. But it's really unique that like all of them focused on the idea of skepticism, the fear of selling out, the fear of being bought, all of those kinds of things. Like that's a really unique moment in the advertising and brand world. So I think it kind of created a completely new ways for brands to start communicating, like communicating with that level of absurdity, that level of cynicism, that level of sarcasm. I think that was like a little bit new at that moment. So it gave us some new ways to kind of view and communicate with the world. And so I guess then this is all nostalgia. This is looking back. What can we learn of it? So I guess if the 90s were reacting against like, this is the big question for us now as designers, as branding strategists, all this thing is that like, if the 90s were reacting against dominant cultures, what do the alternative brands of today need to be rejecting? What are they reacting against? And the problem is we won't know that until about 10 years from now, when we have like a better viewpoint. And I think like, you know, we've got a lot of really big cultural events happening. We have like absolutely dominant tech companies, like a rise in far-right fascism and far-right ideologies, like to the point where it's like influencing governments and the corporations that we interact with daily. Yeah, Fuel and Tank, private equity is the new big corporate brand that sucks the soul out of small fun brands. Yeah, I mean, they're, you know, in every I'm curious, this hasn't happened as much lately. You see like a lot in, you see it in very specific like niche industries a lot, where like where there's this cycle where private equity comes in or massive corporations come in and consolidate. You had this with you know, for the history of beer for the longest time, the whole beer industry was always microbreweries, every single one. And then the mid-century era to 70s, there was a massive consolidation. Budweiser, all of those folks started buying up every small brewery, converting them over to like Bud. And that's why you got these monoliths of Budweiser, Coors, all of that. It's because they just took it all over. And then there was like the next cycle where there was the like era of craft breweries then popped up in response to that, its own form of counterculture where it became about craft again, caring about the quality of it. And we started that cycle a little bit, like AB InBev, owners of Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch, those folks, they started buying up a lot of craft breweries, and that consolidation cycle started again, kind of petered out with just because we got exhausted by the craft and I don't know, we've talked about this a lot in this show, the exhaustion of craft and how that's like ends up being kind of like a meaningless brand promise because everyone can claim craft. But so you had this cycle where everyone starts buying out, and we definitely hit a big time of like, we're private equity that did that in tech. We got these like tech giants now who bought out all the little guys, killing any competition. We talk about games a lot on here because I love them. You see that in games a lot where massive corporations, massive like private equity firms start buying up all of the game companies, rolling them under one house, And now we're seeing the repercussions of that, where like there's been mass layoffs in the video game industry just in an attempt to maximize profit. Where they're like all aiming for giant blockbuster hits instead of cranking out nice small projects that make a little bit of money. So yeah, private equity is tough. And I mean, the funny thing is, like, I at Parliament, like, we love working with some private equity folks. So sorry, it's very, very hot in my office today now. It got muggy in here. But so, like, some private equity folks, like, we've really loved working with. There's a couple that we've worked with, like when we've done our work for Just Food for Dogs. Great. Someday that case study will be up. Great brand. They do like natural dog food. And I love them. We've worked with them a couple times. We worked with them when we did work for West Marine, where it was really about like a lot of people who care a lot coming in, like investing in these brands. They have to like turn things around. I'll say that we were lucky that like the firm that we were working with on those really cared about like the actual like heritage and actual like spirit of the brand. That's a big difference. But I mean, yeah, they want to make their money. And so it's really difficult to like find that balance of like, how do you create this really genuine brand with conviction when there is like a larger corporation that like just wants investor like capital out of it. And I think that's like something that we always need to be mindful of. I always said, like, you know, fuel in the tank. You said you're working on The Sims. Sims is massive and it's owned by EA, if I remember right. Was it a Maxis game? EA? Maxis owned? Well, I'm testing my... And you're like, EA makes incredible games, but they also became a villain at some point. And then, like, but they're, like, the only company that can do what they do. And so you're just like, there's such this, like, complicated mess of an understanding of how all these things work. But... Oh, EA just went private. Oh, man, I've got to do some Googling. I'm out of touch with the EA drama. But anyway, so I think that's some things to start thinking about. I don't know. I think this is like a challenge to myself, is like I want to think about how brands can be pushed to stand against some dominant culture. But I think the real challenge then is like it can't be like a dominant cultural like trend. And I think that's the hard part. Like I already mentioned how Hartley was really smart and chose like a dominant cultural idea that is kind of timeless. The idea of the 9-to-5 job, the idea of status quo, that will never go out of fashion. And so I think that's the thing to be thinking about when you're when you have a brand rooted in kind of more countercultural, more rebellious thing, make sure it's truly rooted in something deeper than just whatever that trend of the moment is. Yeah, fuel tank. Not something I can talk about on the interwebs, but I have some thoughts. We'll grab a beer soon. All right, let's grab a beer and talk about games. All right, sweet. I think that's probably it for the week. That was a fun dive into some old 90s stuff. I think anytime there's this cycle of nostalgia, just remember, like, take time to remember that like all these moments usually come from some kind of countercultural movement, or they're at least in some response to some kind of like deeper thing that is happening in culture. And I think that's like worth remembering, that like as these bits of nostalgia pop back up, and like if you're ever challenged to like follow along with the fashion or trend of these things, go that like little step deeper. Find out like what originally drove that countercultural movement, and you might be able to unlock something special. But maybe next week, since we talked about the 90s, maybe next week we'll finally talk about the transition from the cynicism of and irony of the 90s and early 2000s to then those 2000s, 2010s hipster and millennial branding movements. Because that was a huge shift then, like hard swing against the cynicism into this deeply sincere, deeply caring, focused on like authenticity then became about caring instead of authenticity being about being cynical and sarcastic. So maybe we'll talk about that next week. And there's definitely things to learn from the millennial branding area too. It lasted a long time, 20, 25 years probably. So that's a long time for a design movement to last like that. But all right, everybody, thanks for joining. This was the 90s, and you're not the audience. See y'all same time next week. Thanks everyone in chat. This is great. Yeah, no lunch meetings allowed next week. Ever. Just never. It's illegal. It's illegal to have lunch meetings. When I am monarch, I will make a law that lunch meetings are illegal. All right, have a good week, everyone.